Hello, and welcome to the Urban Century, How Cities Became Global Problem Solvers, a discussion co-hosted by Carnegie, California, and Carnegie's Global Order and Institutions program. Today, we have speakers joining us from Washington, D.C., London, Melbourne, and hopefully either Riyadh or Quito, and I'm in California. A quick word on Carnegie's new West Coast shop. What happens in California matters to the world. What happens in the world matters to California. These simple truths reflect California's scale in part, but more importantly, its connections. And while they seem obvious, these truths result from histories of migration, technological development, geological disruption, and policy innovation. And from bidirectional and circular processes that, while at times visible and at times contested, are often by no means self-evident. Carnegie, California is here to bring those connections into relief and, where appropriate, to help shape them. Today, we are exploring those connections in the form of links between cities and urban areas and global order. By any measure, demographics, land cover, emissions, economic growth, we are living in an urban century. But scale doesn't translate into policy, let alone good policy, or policy impact. Over the last decade, we have seen a conscious effort by cities, as actors in their own right, to develop influence on the global stage, or to put it in a less theatrical and more scholarly way, to achieve influence and impact within the multilateral platforms and international organizations that give shape to global order. This is an historical process, one in which we are midstream to be sure, but there are already notable developments, including those around the G7 and Urban 7, G20 and Urban 20, and the upcoming IPCC special report on cities in AR7. But just as cities are always changing, so is global order. Carnegie is very lucky to have Patrick Stewart helming its program on global order and institutions. And we are today very lucky to have him moderating the discussion with three unique experts on the intersection of global order and urbanization. It's rare, I would say, to conclude this introduction, to have experts who sit at the intersection of cities and international order, of urbanization and international relations and foreign policy. And today, in fact, we have three, maybe four, practitioners and scholars who sit right at that sweet spot. Stuart, great to see you, and thanks for helping us find order in this urban world.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ian. That was a great introduction, and I really am honored for your invitation to collaborate in what is basically your inaugural event as the founding director of our new Carnegie, California office. The fact that we have this West Coast outpost is itself a testament to the growing global influence of subnational actors, and of course, a reflection on the tremendous power that both Silicon Valley and the state of California wield in world politics these days. Carnegie is very lucky to have you, so it's going to be great to collaborate with you in the months and years ahead. As Ian noted, cities are increasingly going global, forming transnational networks that now number well into the hundreds. Mayors and municipalities are trying to fill gaps in global governance that have been created both by the failures of national governments and also the paralysis of international organizations. And as they seek practical solutions to the shared problems of globalization, ranging from climate change to mass migration, they're also challenging the primacy of the state in world politics and upending longstanding assumptions that state sovereignty is the foundational principle of global order. This is a transition of potentially profound and even world historical importance. Among other things, it raises the possibility of what might be called multi-scalar governance, in which authorities at various levels, local, national, international, and even supranational, collectively contribute to global problem solving alongside multiple non-state actors. So our purpose today is to try to make sense of these trends, which really can be a watershed in international politics. So the first question is, how did we get here? What are the historic forces propelling us forward? Or if you regard this as a form of neo-medievalism, maybe back to the future. Second, what does it actually mean for cities to go global? How are mayors and municipal governments adjusting to this new rule? And particularly in seeking to bridge the interests of constituents on the one hand with global level problems, a phenomenon that the late Ben Barber called glocality. Third, how are national governments and international organizations responding to the rise of city diplomacy and to the opportunities and complexities that it presents? In what areas is city diplomacy likely to make the biggest global impact as opposed to being a mere sideshow? To help us answer these and other questions, we're delighted to have three wonderful experts. Simon Curtis is a senior lecturer at the University of East Anglia and a leading theorist on the rise of the global city. I spent last week with my teenage daughter in the Virgin Islands, and my light beach reading was his wonderful book, Global Cities and Global Order, which I commend to all of you. Mauricio Rodas, who I hope will be joining us soon, is co-president of the United Cities and Local Governments Organization, and is also serving on several boards, including the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, which is a prominent, one of the most prominent city networks. He was also the youngest person ever elected to be mayor of Quito, a wonderful city where I should mention my 20-year-old son and budding conservation biologist is currently spending his junior year abroad. Finally, Jessica Treisberg, who goes by Ika, is a research fellow in city diplomacy at the Melbourne Center for Cities. She's an expert on capacity building for city diplomacy, focused in particular on climate resilience and sustainability, particularly in the run-up to COP28, which will be occurring later this year in Dubai. So it's great to have you all here. I'd like to keep this as conversational as possible, asking a couple of questions apiece, perhaps to our experts. Simon, let's start with you. I referenced your great book, which I think does a really masterful job of sort of pulling together issues of world order and the rise of what you call the global city. And you argue that, quote, global cities are part of a fledgling global order. So my question to you is a couple of questions. How did we get here in terms of the causal mechanisms? And is this truly new, or is it more of a reversion to, a pre-Westphalian world where you had a lot of different political units, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Hanseatic League, holding forth alongside sovereign states? So some sense of, brief sense of what your historical study of this tells you about how we got here.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart, and thanks for the praise for the book. It's always much appreciated. I think your introduction sets up well the fact that cities have, in the last 30 to 40 years, increasingly played a large role on the world stage. And I think we have to ask ourselves why this has become the case. It wasn't the case in the middle of the 20th century. It's a relatively new phenomenon, I think, and we need to kind of understand where it came from. And that's what I try to do in that book that you reference. And I think people, as you did in your introduction, people often point to the fact that cities are now of a size and complexity and scale and power that is beginning to challenge states in some ways. But I think we shouldn't forget that the global city, as we see it today, has its origins in state policy, and in a particular form of liberal world order that was generated particularly by the United States and US hegemony over the past 30 to 40 years, and particularly in the Cold War or the post-Cold War period, I would say. So I think if we would look at the drivers, look at the factors that explain the rise of the global city, I would point to 4 interlinked drivers, I think. The first one is an economic one, and it's the crisis of the post-war state and of statism as a way of organizing the political economy. This in the 1970s, without going into too much detail, there was a crisis of the way that we did things in the West, in the US, and in Europe particularly. that led to the collapse of a particular form of embedded liberalism that had characterized that period. And of course, we know the story of Reaganomics and Thatcher and the rise of neoliberalism. And I think this was all part of the origins of the rise of the global city, that we embraced in the 1970s a new form of economic relationship between the state and the market. We restructured the Bretton Woods system that had characterized the post-war global economy. We created a global market for capital. We rolled back the state and regulation. And all of this was something that empowered cities in a way that wasn't necessarily expected at the time, I think, but was a consequence of those policies, the creation of a global market for capital. And cities became command and control centers. And as the state stepped back from its role in allocating decisions in the economy, the transnational firm took up many of those functions, and the global economy was dispersed in terms of global production. Labor moved to the global south. We moved to a sort of post-industrial society in the West, and global cities were empowered by this, and they sucked in capital and talent and resources from the global economy as a result. And there is a natural thing that cities have, which is the agglomeration economy that forms within the city. And as capital flows into that has enabled cities to grow almost exponentially in that period. So that was the first, the economic driver, and it was linked, of course, to technological drivers in terms of new technologies of digital communication, the rise of the internet, which also enabled the complexity of this new economy and the role of cities to form. Now, I think a lot of that was well understood by theorists of the global city, particularly coming out of political geography and other disciplines in the early period. But I think what they missed, and what is extremely important for our discussion today, is the fact that these developments relied on a particular form of geopolitical power, and that was US hegemony and US geopolitical power, the ability to build and defend a global market with liberal characteristics, right? So, the ability to generate that and to defend it gave us the possibility of the global city. And I think the other thing that I would point to, the last thing, is the increased global complexity that we have today and the need to manage that global complexity as a result, which has required new forms of global governance. And it's here that cities have also played a new role in the generation of new city networks, which have been forums for new forms of diplomacy, and for cities playing a role in global governance. And I'm sure, as some of your other guests will point to, we now have up to 300 transnational municipal networks that are playing a major role in many of the global governance challenges that we have, maybe climate or migration or global health, as we've seen in the last few years. So those are four of the interlinked kind of drivers, I think, that are behind the global city. And I think what's also interesting is, though the origins may have been in the economic dimension and economic restructuring at the domestic and then the international level, what is increasingly interesting is that global city is beginning to translate that economic power and influence into political power and influence today. And I think that's that increasing assertiveness and political role that cities are playing is interesting.
Thank you so much. That's great. And I want to get back to both the geopolitics and the neoliberalism, because I'll get back to you in a bit. Both because the geopolitical situation, of course, is changing always, and to some degree, the sort of universality of neoliberalism is beginning to change a little bit too. So I'll get back to that. But I'd love to hear from Ika. I'm really interested from your perspective in how cities interact with existing international institutions, which still in a lot of ways provide sort of the lattice work or structure to world order, including in international organizations, whether it's the UN or the World Bank, the EU, or multilateral frameworks like the UNFCCC. I know you've been working with the Council of Cities on the run-up to COP28. Do you see it sort of an open door? Do you see it sort of a begrudging acknowledgement of the role of these groups within established international organizations, or how have you seen the dynamism of cities either being leveraged by these organizations or in some ways being sidelined?
Thank you. I think so. I work more from the other end in terms of the city perspective, looking at the supranational organizations and the international organizations. And that's where I think there's a whole diversity of ways that cities are connecting in and choosing to connect in, particularly around global issues that are felt locally, like climate change, and others that Simon mentioned around migration and things like that, where I think these are the cities find themselves at that intersection where policy is being increasingly, devolved to that local level, and so they're having greater responsibility for these really novel and complex challenges that they've never had before, and often are looking for guidance, and that's one of the drivers for them in engaging with these international organizations and these networks to try and guide their activities, help them feel, I guess, comforted by the level of sophistication of others, and also being able to engage in that sort of collective efficacy. So in terms of the perspective of the international organization, that's probably more of a question for Maurizio, if he's able to join us later. But certainly that's what we're seeing from the city perspective in how they engage. And that's one of the reasons why we've developed this city diplomacy masterclass, which allows us to identify with cities the specific skills and capacities that they feel that they're lacking. Some of this was identified in the 2022 biennial survey that the Chicago Council and the Melbourne Centre for Cities did collaboratively, in terms of identifying who has what training and who needs what training, and what that looks like, and what that means in terms of their willingness and ability to engage internationally. I think that report found that 50% of people working in this space actually had no formal training related to international engagement or city diplomacy. And 2/3 of the cities said that they would engage more if they had greater skills. And so that's where we're focusing our efforts, is really building the capacity of the cities to engage with that international realm, and then allowing others to also undertake the capacity development at the international realm itself.
Can you give us a sense of sort of the nature of the network and the sort of identity or scale of the cities with which your group engages in? And Simon may have some thoughts about this later as well. It's often the case that when transnational networks of different sorts, whether it's multi-stakeholder networks or subnational actors, are trying to find their voice globally, it's quite easy for those from the West or from the global North, in a sense, to have, a leg up on things. And when you think about, Simon has written that, he's described a phenomenon that he calls sort of planetary urbanization. But of course, London is not Lagos, and Tokyo is not Dhaka, and New York is not Nairobi. And so it kind of made me wonder, and I'll ask Simon this in a second, but how many truly global cities are there? There are patterns of sort of empowerment, but then also sort of exclusion, or sort of core periphery dynamics that you get in dependency literature. What is the nature of the network of cities that you're working with, Ika, in terms of trying to help build this capacity? Does it range from countries in the OECD world to developing sort of lower income countries and lower middle income countries? Could you give us a sense of what does this training actually entail, and what kind of skills do they need?
So again, there's a great variety of networks. So the cities that we work with are all networked themselves, and some of them, are part of the same networks, and some of them are learning about networks from each other that they've never heard of. We deliberately have a really diverse cohort that we work with. At the moment, we are exclusively working with Chinese and Australian cities, quite deliberately, to have that sort of global north-south exchange. but also those very different contexts that each of the participants can learn from. And they're finding that fruitful in the initial feedback that we're getting in terms of the ability to learn from those very different contexts. Within those, there's a great variance. We've got some that are maybe part of half a dozen networks, and then we've got others that are part of every network you can probably list. Well, maybe not the 300 that Simon mentioned, but rather a lot. And so there's I think that the point you made about how do you kind of engage, how do you create equity in that space? How do you make sure that there's an ability, a capacity for all cities to engage, not just, in different countries, but also different parts of different countries. When even capital cities in Australia, for example, don't have any representative obligation to other cities within their same state. And so how do you actually make sure that all of those cities might have equitable capacity to engage and to interact with that global realm, and to get the most benefit from it. In terms of the
go ahead. No, go ahead.
In terms of the way that we structure the training, interestingly, the top skill that cities identified in that 2022 report that they were lacking was strategic planning. So actually just strategic skills that are not necessarily specific to city diplomacy in any way, but that's actually an area that cities wanted some specific assistance with in this space. In addition to that, general awareness, knowledge, Michele Acuto, who's our director here at the Melbourne Centre for Cities, runs them through, who are the networks and how do you engage with them? And then we have a series of guest presenters from each of these sort of key networks to help the cities to unpack, okay, well, what are the mechanisms by which we can engage with these particular networks, and what do they do? And is that potentially a good strategic fit for us, or is it not? And then also we take them through some sort of targeted skills development around the diplomatic tradecraft, some of those things that if you were in a national level diplomatic role, you would engage with through a diplomatic academy or similar, but where there's no mechanism for that at a local level. So actually just learning some of the rules of the game, so to speak, and being able to do a bit of a strategic reflective exercise around, what cities are actually really trying to achieve in this, and then helping them to kind of step that through to make it a reality for them.
Do you find that the Australian government and perhaps even the Chinese government is that they, in a sense, welcome this? I should note that one of the reasons why we're having this is that later this month, the United States is going to be sponsoring the latest gathering of sort of mayors in Denver, and part of that is really being motivated by the fact that the United States State Department has created an office now of subnational diplomacy, run by a very able woman named Nina Hishigian, and she's really tried to energize outreach to U.S. subnational actors, cities and states, but then also provide a docking point, I guess, if you will, for their foreign counterparts to get together. Have you found that the Australian Foreign Ministry is sympathetic to this desire and to the potential upside of having cities, as well as Australian states, collaborate in this vein?
I think there's a variety of responses within the national level government and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But our City Diplomacy Masterclass is funded by our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade through the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. So there's certainly an interest in exploring this space further. And we certainly do reference the US example quite frequently in our discussions with with our federal government. But that's definitely that's a space, that's a very current space for us. We'll be having a roundtable with our city diplomacy masterclass participants and a number of federal representatives in May, specifically looking at the way that we understand subnational diplomacy and city level diplomacy in Australia, and what that looks like within the context of a multi-tier governance system.
Simon, I referenced before that I'd come back to you on this question of, how many global cities, in a sense, truly are there? And perhaps there are many that have different aspects of globality or globalism attached to them, but there clearly appear to be sort of hierarchies of cities, for better or for worse, as well as you make the point that there's also tremendous inequality within the global cities, even those that are, in a sense, would be in the Premier League of, if there were such a thing. Do you have any thoughts on how this cities going global has influenced patterns of inequality, both globally and also within nations themselves? I'm sorry, I think you're still maybe on mute.
Sorry. I think in terms of that question, we have to go back to what I talked about at the beginning, which was the origins of the global city. And when I talk about global cities in my work, and from a kind of more scholarly perspective, I think we talk about the global city as a concept. So it kind of picks out things that are common trends within cities around the world. I mean, of course, there are cities that are more connected than others. There is a hierarchy of cities in that sense. There are cities that are specialized in particular functions within the global economy. All of that is true. But I think what the global city idea is doing for us is saying there is this connection between cities, the forms that they take, the way that they are materially, the types of inequalities that they have within them, and the international system and the ideologies that are underpinning the way that we're organizing society and the economy. And so the global city really is connecting the new sort of forms that cities have taken with these bigger forms of international order, of great power politics that are shaping the international system. And so in my work, that's what I've tried to do. I tried to connect things that used to be seen as separate. Cities were always seen as being, part of the interior of the state, its territory, within the sovereign jurisdiction of the state. Now, they clearly are that still, but they also are being lifted out of that context by these kind of events, connected together in global networks, in networks that are reshaping the cities themselves, and by extension, reshaping the nature of the state as well. And so I think that's for me the interesting question. That's what we're getting at when we talk about the global city. We're talking about something that is identifying common structural trends that are affecting all cities to some extent, that are part of that system. And to a large degree, all cities have been affected by technology, by being part of a global market over the last 4 decades, by the technological connectivity that we have. And I think what is interesting about this is that now we have cities and their representatives acting on a global stage within these networks, and these cities have developed new capacities that they're translating into global governance outcomes, as you've discussed. So I think this is all really novel. You asked me earlier what is new, and to some extent, cities do have these unprecedented features and capabilities that they didn't have in the past now. Even though the city itself is a much longer has a much longer lineage than the state as a political form, I don't think we're going back to the form of neo-medievalism that you talked about in the past. What we have is a new, interesting relationship between the state, the city, global governance, international organizations, something that is relatively novel, that we have never seen before, and that cities are having real impacts in that space now. Now, I think geopolitically, what will be interesting in the future is whether we continue to have that system, because this is something that in the 90s and the beginning of this century, we could be quite confident that this was having transformative effects on the nature of sovereignty, on the nature of the relationship between the city and the state. Now, what has happened in recent years, I think, is that the state has begun to reassert itself. And we also have a changing balance of power and a shift in the nature of international order with the rise of China, the rise of alternative illiberal forms of state market relationship. And that, I think, is now moving us into uncharted territory.
Yeah, let me pick up on that. Yeah, if you have other comments on particularly sort of the Chinese, in a sense, conception of perhaps the global city. Because in my mind's eye, I'm thinking, this is as you've described it, this is part of a liberal or perhaps particularly neoliberal project, or associated with, the advent of hyperglobalization, advent of sort of the unipolar moment, sort of all reinforced by those things. But of course now, as we were getting at here, there's at least, a quote unquote, the U.S. defense strategists would call China a peer competitor, right? And obviously hugely important economically on some measures, as larger than the U.S. economy, depending on how one measures it. But then you've also got, particularly in the wake of COVID, I wonder whether or not you might want to talk about, how you see COVID, which, cities above all in some of the most prosperous cities really took it on the chin in a lot of ways during COVID. People are emptying out, and some of those prosperous cities, people going to the hinterland, et cetera, and, now being dragged sometimes kicking and screaming back to the office, but and perhaps moving back into the city. But at the same time, you have people talking about, peak globalization as having maybe have occurred right at the end of the global financial crisis, et cetera. So you have, and the fragmentation of the world economy, shrinking of global supply chains, et cetera. Do you think that those dynamics, I mean, perhaps too soon to tell, but do you think those dynamics are going to shape this sort of ongoing balance between, in a sense, love-hate relationship between the city and the state, perhaps, I guess you'd probably say?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot there to think about. I mean, I think the sort of the big overarching trend that you're talking about here is the end of this, potentially the end of this period of neoliberal globalization that we've seen over the last 4 decades. Has it reached its kind of zenith? Are we in a transition or a tipping point into some kind of new system? And as I've said, I think that there is ultimately an intrinsic connection between great powers, cities, and international order. And there are many trends that suggest that we might be moving into a new form of that relationship. So first of all, of course, is the rise of China itself, and the rise of China brings with it an alternative ideology. It brings with it an alternative potential direction for international order. But what it also brings with it, and has brought with it over the last 10 years, is a new form of urbanization. The Chinese have recognized this intrinsic connection between urbanization, infrastructure, and geopolitics. So I'm referring, of course, to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this huge investment in infrastructure that's been built out across the Eurasian space over the last 10 years, announced by President Xi in 2013. New forms of transport, new forms of digital connectivity, urban corridors, logistics centers, a potential shift in the way that we have seen these urban hierarchies that you talked about earlier. All of that has happened. And what it also, I think, portends is the rise of the authoritarian state and the rise of state capitalism at the level of the international system. And of course, China is one state that is big enough and has ambitions to reshape international order itself and wants to do that. So as we said earlier, the US was behind the rise of the global city and the system that gave it its conditions of possibility, if you like. I think China is now producing a challenge to that. But at the same time, there are other challenges that are coming from within that international order itself, not least the US's ambivalence in recent times about its role as an international leader, as a great power in the international system. So you have this system of US-led neoliberal capitalism over the last 4 decades, We have the rise of a great power that is now espousing a form of state capitalism. That in itself is a challenge. Now, in my work, I would say that what we have to think about here is the connection between the great power and the form of urbanization that it is pushing. It might be very different to the types of global city that we've seen in the past. Now, the other interesting trend, I think, is number one, in the wake of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and then in the wake of the pandemic, which you mentioned, the return of the state. Those two things have, in a way, really put into question this idea that you can have a neoliberal economic philosophy, and that they've put that into question in theoretical terms and practical terms. And so many of the trends now are the return of the state as an investor in ways that undermine this idea of a neoliberal order.
It's really remarkable that the contingency of some of these things and some of these trends begins to come out, and leading one to think that yes, the trends can be reversed, and two steps forward, one step back, perhaps as well. So we'll have to see where that trajectory goes. Ika, I'd be interested, particularly since you're addressing both Australian cities and Chinese cities, just picking up on what Simon was saying about sort of conceivably a different Chinese model, and also thinking about sort of civic space in general. Not only has the city, I think, particularly amongst its boosters, been seen as an engine of economic growth and dynamism, but also an engine of sort of cultural achievement, civilization, great expression, but also in a sense of freedom, in at least in its sort of best Western conception, if I can say that. And yet, the picture that Simon portrayed, at least suggesting that, well, he didn't use the word dystopian, but given the sort of heavy surveillance, et cetera, at least state surveillance as opposed to capitalism surveillance that we have in the West, you do also get a sense that sometimes that some of the civic space may actually be smaller and also or more constrained. Do you find when you're working with your Chinese counterparts, there are certain shared sort of aspirations and challenges, but are there sort of unique things that either have to be taken off the table when you're just because of political sensitivities, or that just have to be taken into consideration because of the nature of the heavy duty authoritarianism of the Chinese government?
There's certainly a lot of considerations. It's two very different contexts in terms of, political sphere, but also just demographically. Within this cohort, we've got cities like Guangzhou, Tianjin, both with more than 14 million inhabitants each. And then we've got Australian capitals that have maybe 150,000 official residents within that capital city because of the nature of our, breaking up into smaller local government areas. So very, very different in terms of the types of scope and scale of what they're dealing with, and the toolkits that they have to do so. I think that one of the reasons why we've been really successful in getting support from both the Australian government and the Chinese government for this specific city diplomacy masterclass is not just that there's a new recognition that city diplomacy is important and that it's good to, increase the capacity of individual cities to participate, but specifically because it's related to climate change. And it seems that there's a level of willingness for both the Chinese and the Australian government to enable cities to participate in that conversation. But perhaps if we were focused on a different area of city diplomacy around human rights or migration or some of the other really core issues that cities are very involved with, we may have a very different reception. And I think we're very aware of that. The cities are aware of that, and the national governments are aware of that. But it's always a delicate balance, with different levels of government that are sort of working their way into this new space together. We all need to feel our way to some extent.
Fantastic. I want to follow up with a couple of other questions. I do want to remind folks who are on this call that they can put some questions or comments in the chat on YouTube, and we will check those out and might be able to get to them if you have specific questions or observations for our panelists. And I think we'll go ahead and bring Ian back in here too, I think, since he's got a lot to say on this issue. But let me continue with you, Ika, a little bit. I'm interested that in terms of what specific issues you think cities are particularly well poised or particularly perhaps seized with in terms of city diplomacy. One of the things that I've remarked on is that everybody, whenever you talk about the role of cities, they mention the C40 cities, cities group, basically co-founded, I believe, by Michael Bloomberg and others. Definitely more than 40 cities now around the world dealing with climate change. It's sometimes been hard to find other examples that are quite as obvious. Migration is often spoken of there are certain cities that I think are focusing on sort of democratic values, focusing on issues with respect to data, perhaps some issues with respect to security, particularly against terrorism, et cetera. Do you think that in a sense, the climate space is sort of sui generis or really the sweet spot for this sort of city to city interaction and sort of lessons learned, or does this go much deeper than that specific sphere?
I think that climate change makes sense in the sense that this is a global challenge that's experienced very differently in different localities, that there is that geographical bound. But I don't think that it's necessarily that cities are specifically well placed to engage in a particular area. I think it's also that cities are experiencing the outcomes. They're experiencing what this feels like on the ground, and not just in climate change. I think that's why we've seen this rapid expansion looking at migration, integration, social cohesion. Before I was in this scholarly space, I was in a practitioner space, and one of the novel areas that we were faced with was right-wing extremism. And so we very suddenly, in the city that I worked for, had very visible public activity from right-wing extremist groups. And that was a novel space for us. We'd never dealt with that at a city level. And there were other cities within the state that also were dealing with that for the first time. Australia doesn't have a very strong history in responding to right-wing extremism. That doesn't say that we haven't had that as a presence, but we don't have a familiar response network like some other countries do. But also we don't have internal mechanisms whereby cities can engage in the types of cabinet in confidence conversations that happen at a national and state level within Australia around right-wing extremism. And so all of these cities in Australia actually found ourselves reaching out to networks that are based in London and based in France to help guide our response and to help to organise and understand what was happening, and then to be able to bring that information back. So I don't think that was because as cities we were particularly well placed to respond, but we had to respond, and we had no mechanism by which to do that within our domestic context. And so we actually reached out and engaged internationally for that. So I think that gives a bit of that's an example of how it can be not just a matter of cities stepping up because they are at the forefront, but just because they have to, and they don't necessarily have another option that's available to them at the time.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So you're suggesting that there's a lot of sort of mutual learning that can go on among cities. I remember a decade ago it was a full decade ago being in Seattle at a meeting, and ran into somebody who was the deputy mayor, who had said that in the past year, Seattle alone had something like 250 visiting city delegations from around the world, just trying to learn everything from sort of waste management to, urban policy, et cetera. Ian, I want to turn to you, if I might. You've spent a lot of time, both when you were at the State Department, you helped organize the sort of U.S. diplomacy with respect to the UN Conference on Urban Sustainable Development, or Habitat 3, which I believe was in Ecuador, where our friend Mauricio was mayor. And at the same time, you've probably gotten a chance to see some of the constraints, but also possibilities that cities have in sort of making their presence felt on the international scene. It strikes me, I always wonder whether or not cities face a ton of constraints, whether it's budgetary, legal, or constitutional. Do you see some? Do you see those constraints and possibilities? How do you see them being sort of playing out on the global stage?
Thanks, Stuart. And I've been enjoying this immensely and learning a lot. And I would just say, as a sort of public service announcement for those who are joining us, that I promise Ika and I, we also have books. I, for one, might check out some books from the library of Curtis and Patrick, but we read, practitioners though we are also. Mauricio, who it appears wasn't able to join us, was the mayor of Quito during Habitat 3. He also was the youngest mayor of Quito, and it is one of the deployed a major infrastructure project in that city and can speak to some of those issues. I think one of the things he likes to say, because I've seen him and know him, with regards to cities on the global stage, and I'll just offer this sort of in his stead, and his phrase is that the Urban 20, which is the engagement group of the G20, is a Ferrari that hasn't yet been taken out of the garage. That's his concept of it. And I think what he means when he says it, one, is that the G20 is a particularly good multilateral platform with which to engage for cities and urban areas. And what that gets at is the interesting question of which of the institutions that give shape to the global order are worth engaging for cities. And I think that gets to the question of limitations too, Stuart. And so are you engaging those which have economic influence, which give shape to the financial world, and access to finance and credit is a key issue for cities, particularly in Africa and Asia, where most of global urbanization is happening. And so I think that one of the limitations that you see sort of exhibited is to which platforms should cities turn their attention, because they don't have a lot of time or resources. And so you could sort of drop a list of limitations that shape their diplomatic engagement, or the way that cities are working on the global stage. The first and foremost, to Ika and Melbourne's great credit, is often a sense for diplomatic practice and habits and organization. I mean, when Kissinger wrote his history of Westphalia, hundreds of pages are dedicated to just diplomatic practice and how modern diplomatic practice came about. And it is something to learn. And city officials have made unbelievable strides in that space because they've been supported by orgs like Melbourne. Another limitation is the political situation within their own cities. It is tough to be gone from your city. It is tough to make the case, leaving aside the good climate example, that some issues that feel global are actually super relevant local, and their way to address them and shape them is at the sort of international or global level. That's almost a political question. So I think it's another limitation we see. And then in the middle there is an interesting bit, which I'll just say finally in terms of constraints and limitations, which is the national government and the state system in which these cities and urban areas operate. And so you rightly flagged trends around global cities and urbanization. And I just quickly described that, broadly speaking, the geographies where it's happening. The networks to which you referred are aware of this too, and have membership that reflects that. But national governments are too, and this goes for national governments in the global north and the global south. And so if you look at development trends or programs that are being rolled out by countries, including Australia, but also Germany, the United Kingdom, perhaps increasingly the United States, there's attention to the development of urban areas in the global south being paid by those in the West, China, Japan, and in the global north. And I think what's captured there is, of course, a recognition that we have a shared future and urban areas will shape that, but also that these are increasingly places for influence and impact. And how that influence and impact will shape the global order going forward is, I think, the open question that we're discussing in part today.
That's great. Thank you so much. Here's a question from Zvi Lev, or Lev, who's a sustainable mobility consultant in Quebec. There often seems to be a conflict between the priorities of urban and suburban areas, and similarly between national versus municipal governments. How can we reconcile these different perspectives? And I presumably manage, or at least manage that tension, I would imagine. Simon, do you have any thoughts on that? Because these cities, you must have sort of struggled with this, thinking about how does one define a city, and it has hinterlands, and then often from what I gather I'm talking to folks who had dealt with Mumbai, and Mumbai has actually a rather limited budgetary resources to be able to do its own thing, as opposed to the Indian state that it's in, and so that might place some constraints on an otherwise quite robust city in terms of city diplomacy. Do you have any thoughts on this urban, suburban, exurban aspect of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a better question for the two urbanists on the panel. But I from my perspective, I think one of the issues this gets at again is the notion of sovereignty, and who controls tax revenue. Cities are, they're playing this increasingly important role in international affairs, but they don't necessarily have all of the resources they need in which to do that, and they're also placed in competition with each other. So there is, this is evolved within a paradigm of market competition essentially, and so therefore these resources are going to be competed over, and it is going to be problematic because of this, and it is difficult to reconcile that within the model that gave rise, I think, to the global city. So that again is, when I mentioned earlier that there are internal issues as well as external challenges to the global city model, I think that's identifying one of them.
Thank you, Ika or Ian. Did you have any thoughts on this particular topic? Otherwise, I can move on to another one. Okay, I'll move on here. It's a question from Vincent Campos, who's a crisis manager and a former FSO, which I assume means Foreign Service Officer, if he's in the United States. So a former diplomat. How can city-to-city networks minimize conflicts with the federal central government that may view city geopolitical growth and influence as a possible threat to central government authority? It's a little bit somewhat similar to the last one, but have you had experience in which these are in a sense workarounds from a central government, which, for instance, might not be actually trying to do the right thing? We seem to have seen a certain amount of this, in California, certainly at the state level, but then also from a number of mayors of cities during the Trump years. And one could imagine us seeing that script flipped with a Democrat in the White House. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Sorry, who was that directed to?
Okay.
I'm happy to jump in with it.
Yeah, go ahead, Ika.
So I think, that's the $1 million question. This is a very current conversation in terms of, how do you minimize that? We need to have engagement. One of the things that I just wanted to drop into this was that when surveyed, a majority of cities have said explicitly that they want their activities to remain independent of federal or state level diplomatic activity and interference. And so that's something that's very relevant to cities, that cities are very aware of. And then there isn't necessarily although there are some efforts to bring, you know, policies into alignment and activities into alignment, that there is that really clear desire to stay completely independent and be able to act as independent actors in that space.
Stuart, if I could jump in here, I mean, leave it to a foreign service officer to ask a good question like this that brings the international politics into local dynamics. But I think you can look at a historical development and a practice. And the historical development is that some of these city networks focus on actions that can be delivered at the city level or urban level themselves, small steps that can be taken, particularly adaptation, resilience, but also in the space of mitigation. Inevitably, there's a ceiling on those steps, and they come into contact with needing national policies, good government, multi-level governance, and financing. And that brings them into contact with their national governments and with international organizations, which is, again, why we're talking about this here today. I think that's where we are in the historical development of cities dealing with global challenges. A second is that if you look at some of the settings, such as the Urban 20 and how cities conduct themselves in them, it is very clear that there are some cities that can speak independently of their national governments, and there are some that cannot. It's not difficult to figure out which. The experienced diplomat at the table, city diplomat or national diplomat, knows what's happening and has to interpret it as such. But it's quite difficult to, I think, give a space where cities can speak entirely freely of their national governments if they can't already. To create that space would be its own challenge. Whereas in response to the previous US administration, the response of cities to the exiting of the Paris Agreement was one quite in contrast to that of the national government. Not all cities can do that.
Yeah, Ian, let me prod you a little bit on the question of promising spheres of activity. I mentioned climate being, in some sense, one of the most obvious, given the increasing percentage of greenhouse gas emissions coming from cities, the potential economies of scale from living in cities in terms of being more efficient in one's use of energy, et cetera. Are there other, if you were to point to where you might think of some either growth areas or areas where these different city networks might be might be wise to sort of invest in or to learn from one another? Are there particular spheres or categories of interaction that you think matter the most?
With only 3 minutes left and deferring to Simon and Ika, I would say that it's for the cities to decide, because they simultaneously exchange best practices around challenges and then turn themselves into shared common voices on the global stage. In which places have they not yet been able to do that, in part because of philanthropic funding from other areas, or because the challenges haven't yet presented themselves? I would think if you believe artificial intelligence is a revolution that's going to happen quite quickly, that might be a space for interesting engagement. Barcelona, Amsterdam, New York are doing work there. But they will sense it, because, as Ika said, they feel the effects.
Ika, did you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I agree with Ian. I think that's going to be something that's going to unfold in the coming years.
Great. I can give Simon the last word here in terms of that, in terms of where you see, are there areas or spheres of activity where you
yeah,
see?
I think you're quite right to say that the C40 is the one that always gets talked about, because it's maybe the biggest and the most powerful and the most sort of high profile. But I know Michele Couto, who is now in Melbourne, when he was at UCL in London a few years ago, did some work on empirical work on mapping, what are the issue areas that city networks are exercising diplomacy in. And the environment was top of the list. Climate change was top of the list, but there was also inequality, gender, health, peace building. So there's mayors for peace. There are other issue areas that are certainly there, even though I think climate is the biggest. But I think what's very interesting about the climate and the C40 example, and one of the reasons why it gets so much attention, is because it is a really good example of how a global city network or municipal network of transnational municipal network can operate at a scale that states are not. So when it comes to climate change, having a network of, I don't know what it is, 160, 180 cities now in the C40 operates at the level of the problem, where we have built a political system based on the territorial state, where we know that states find it hard to cooperate. Cooperation is suboptimal. States are competing with each other. States have different ideologies. Cities are creating a political entity that is the scale of the global challenge, and it's almost bypassing that state level system in a way. So I think one of the interesting things over the last 20, 30 years is we are very quietly, it goes under most people's radar, building a political structure, a political assemblage that can deal with these global level problems where states have failed.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thanks so much to all of you. We will not be able to answer this, but I do want to at least close with a very interesting question here from Milan Todorovic. It says, as the world continues to become a global village, do you think that we'll ever move beyond nation states so that cities are the only units of governance? We are not in a position, alas, given the fact that we've run out of time, to answer that question. But the fact that that question is being asked is at least a testament to how profound this change and the increased energizing or the increased energy beyond behind civic advocacy and activism, and also city networks has become. And we'll be looking to see whether or not cities, and mayors, given their pragmatic bent, their results-oriented bent, will continue to make inroads on what we've seen in the past as basically a state system, and contribute to multi-scalar governance, whether or not it has appropriate degrees of what the Europeans call subsidiarity or not. But it will be quite exciting. And the one thing I will guarantee you is that as we dive into this new research agenda and policy agenda, that Carnegie, California, under the able leadership of Ian Klaus, will be at the forefront of some of these discussions, and we will continue to have wonderful people and experts like Simon Curtis and Ika Triesberg along for the ride and along to help us point out their insights. Thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you for all of us on the call. And we will look forward to seeing you again very soon here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much.